Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit now. Responsible scientists care about the social impacts of their inventions, their technology. Anybody who follows the headlines, you've seen the impact that artificial intelligence has had in recent years. We put together a panel of folks who look at social impacts, and they're going to now share their thoughts with you. So here's who's on our panel. Scott Niekum is a professor in our department, and he heads our Personal Autonomous Robots Lab. Robert Chesney is a professor and associate dean for our law school. Bill Swan, professor of social and personality psychology. And our moderator is Peter Stone, Professor Peter Stone. Thank you all.
I think we can all speak fairly loudly.
Loud, right?
Well, if not, we'll go and grab that. So, yeah. So thanks, Bruce, for the introduction. So I'm Peter Stone. I'm a professor here. I'm gonna moderate. So I'm just gonna set the stage here, and then I'm gonna try to get out of the way as much as possible. I'll first say what the topic is, then I'll introduce the panelists in a little bit more detail and why this set of people is the right to be talking about this question. And then I'll pose a set of questions. So the title of this panel is AI and Society. And we're at a time when most people or many people are either wildly enthusiastic about artificial intelligence and how it's going to solve all the world's problems and lead us to utopia, or overly fearful, I'd say, about artificial intelligence and how it's going to lead to a dystopian outcome and it's going to destroy the world. And I think that this is fueled in many ways, and also people are either that's right now because we're at a period where everybody is sort of lauding the successes of artificial intelligence. But if you look at over time, we've also seen that people's attitudes towards artificial intelligence are also similarly extreme. Either it's a huge success, everything's going great, and look at all the things we can do with it, or it's an abject failure, and I don't want to be caught dead hiring anybody who does artificial intelligence because all the things were promised and nothing was delivered. And so it's sort of this boom or bust cycle of perceptions, fueled often by the press, fueled often by science fiction, the movies. But I think I don't want this panel to be about what the definition of artificial intelligence is. I'm gonna lay out a working definition that we'll use, partly to counter what I think is one of the misconceptions of artificial intelligence, which is that it's one thing, that there's an artificial intelligence, and if you do it, you achieve it, then you can just sprinkle it over a whole bunch of different applications, and they automatically become intelligent. And that's just not the case. At least in current day. In the current day, it might be that we can create a car that can drive itself. It might be that we can create a program that can beat the world champion in Go, or a robot that can fold your laundry. But none of those implies the other, right? Each requires a sustained effort in research and development to make them happen. So the working definition of artificial intelligence I'm going to put forward to the panel is that it's a science and a set of computational technologies that are inspired by, but typically operate quite differently from the ways people use their nervous systems, bodies to sense, learn, reason, and take action. Okay, so you may want to quibble with this, but one of the important points here is that it's a set of technologies. It's not one thing. And so I'm going to challenge the panelists. This is sort of difficult to do, but to go through this 40-minute panel without ever using AI as an isolated noun. Without saying, AI will do this. We can say AI technologies, or AI for healthcare, or machine learning applied to this or that, but not just AI. And I'll try to call you on that if that happens. It's hard to do. What I'm also going to challenge the panelists to do is to discuss both the positive potentials for artificial intelligence technologies in various parts of society. What are some of the barriers that we see as in the way between achieving those possible benefits? Right, so you might say, we see the possible benefit of perfect diagnoses of diseases, but what are the barriers? But we can't do that now, so what are the barriers to get from here to there? And also, what are some of the risks? Right, so as with any technology, AI technologies have potential for both good and nefarious uses. And so that's sort of going to be the theme here. And I'll start with the positives, I'll then move to the barriers, then I'll move to the risks, and then we'll conclude with sort of the assessment of which outweigh the others. Okay, so before I pose those questions, let me just introduce. We're going to be talking about AI from both a technical perspective, a legal perspective, and a social perspective. And so, from the technical side, we have Professor Scott Niekum. He's an assistant professor and director of the Personal Autonomous Robotics Lab in the CS department here. The goal of his research is to enable personal robots to be deployed in the home and workspace with minimal intervention by robotics experts. With this in mind, he focuses on developing algorithms to solve problems that robot learners encounter in the real world interactive settings. His work contributes to the fields of both machine learning and robotics, including topics such as learning from demonstration, robotic manipulation of objects, human-robot interaction, interactive perception, and reinforcement learning. Next to him is Bobby Chesney. He's the Charles I. Francis Professor in Law and Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the UT Austin Law School. In addition, he's the director of the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law, a university-wide research unit bridging across disciplines to improve understanding of international security issues. In this context, he's recently hosted and organized a speaker series on campus focusing on the current and future legal implications of AI technologies, and brought in some prestigious people from off campus to start thinking about these issues. And then finally, we have Professor Bill Swan. He's a professor of social and personality psychology here at UT Austin. Bill is best known for developing self-verification theory, which focuses on people as they see themselves, a desire to be known and understood by others. I missed a phrase there in the copy, but the theory assumes that once people develop firmly held beliefs about themselves, they come to prefer that others see them as they see themselves, even if their self-views are negative. Bill's most recent emphasis has been on identity fusion theory. People become fused with a group when they feel a visceral sense of connectedness with a group, so strong that the borders between the self and the group become porous and permeable. And this is relevant because people are starting to talk about what will AI technologies do to our social fabric, in addition to the legal fabric and sort of technical. So with that as setting the stage, I'll pose the first question and then move down the line. From your technical, legal, and social perspectives, what are the biggest potential positive impacts of artificial intelligence technologies in the coming years? So let's start with Scott.
Sure. So I guess good news first. To me, at least, the most salient thing is that we're getting to a point I gotta be careful with my words now. In many fields where artificially intelligent algorithms are being deployed, where we're getting superhuman performance, and this is across the board from bus scheduling to medical diagnoses via things like IBM Watson. And I guess what I mean by superhuman is not that any of these particular systems are any more intelligent than a human, as Peter was sort of pointing out. We're not talking about general intelligence or intelligence the way we normally think of it, but we're thinking about specific systems that are performing better than humans perform in those domains. And I think the biggest thing to take into consideration about how it's going to benefit our lives is, even though there is going to be, especially in factory settings and things like that, there's going to be some level of automation where robots or artificially intelligent agents are replacing people in some instances, but for the most part, I think what we're seeing is that there's going to be more and more augmentation of people. So instead of Watson replacing a doctor, that's obviously not going to happen. It's going to make doctors' diagnoses more reliable. It's going to catch things that they can't catch. There are over 100,000 new medical papers published every year. Most doctors don't read all of them. Many doctors, I suspect, don't read any of them and are not keeping up on all the most relevant literature. And so this can help them do their job better. But obviously, Watson cannot do all of the doctor's job. Are we going to go sort of one benefit at a time and discuss, or do you want to talk about the other technical benefits?
Go through what you think of as the benefits, and then we'll go to the barriers and the risks.
One of the ones that's most salient for me as a robotics researcher is that artificially intelligent robots are going to let us do sort of two really big classes of things that are just not doable by humans. So again, rather than replacing humans, they're going to sort of create a better working, happier, healthier world that augments human capabilities. So one of these is doing dangerous tasks. So going into a collapsing building and trying to see if we can search and rescue people. Or what's another example? So going into melting down nuclear reactors and trying to do something sort of in a Fukushima type stuff. So these are places where we do not want to be sending humans in the first place, and so again they augment our capabilities rather than replacing them. And I think the one that's most salient to the research that I particularly do with personal robots is working with disabled populations, for example, and giving someone who might be quadriplegic, for example, a sense of autonomy back that they can't get just through in-home care. So if they have something like an interface that they can operate with their eyes, that they can use to control a robot, do everything from one of the favorites, actually, in a project I worked on at a company called Willow Garage, was a quadriplegic man, Henry Evans, that we worked with, loved using the robot to itch his face, because that was one thing. He was also mute, I should mention, and the difficulty with that is he couldn't even verbally describe without an enormous amount of effort of where he wanted to be itched. So it's giving these people a sense of autonomy and dignity back. And this is something that really only an artificially intelligent agent can do, and that we really weren't able to do before. So I think those are sort of the big check boxes for that.
All right, so augmentation, doing dangerous tasks, and helping disabled people. My guess is he probably was trying to scratch his face, not make it more itchy.
Oh, yes.
Good. So from the legal perspective.
Right, so I was so intrigued when you first pitched it that way in the note before as we were planning. What is the legal perspective? Because you can look at that at two levels. You can look at it as a question about what is AI, what do the various forms of AI mean for law and legal institutions as such, and then separately, what does it mean for everything else everyone is doing, but where the law has something important to say? And so I thought separately about these things. I wanted to share a few thoughts. Being a lawyer, of course, I want to think about what does it mean for law and all these people we're producing at the other end of campus who are getting their JDs. What does the future hold for them in light of this? Lawyers do an array of different things, and if you think about it from a sort of value chain perspective, the high end of the value chain and the low end of the value chain, it's a bit pyramidal. There's a load of things that lawyers are asked to do traditionally at the low end of the value chain where you don't really need a load of training, you don't really need a load of acumen and skill and experience. It's drudgery type work, and then it goes up and you need fewer and fewer people to do the higher value, the higher order work. AI in its various manifestations already is disrupting the base of that pyramid, and actually that disruption was taking place through non-AI means already. It should have been disrupted long ago, but since in our society lawyers make the rules, that's America, we have long since organized ourselves in a way that protect the guild, and we've protected the work and kept that base of the pyramid just for the lawyers, and there have been inroads on it through self-help books and various ways in which other professions have been getting in and in a lower cost way taking away the base of that pyramid. AI is, I think, going to really disrupt that trend. And what is it that's at that base of the pyramid? It's information processing and searching and triaging and sorting and extracting relevant knowledge out of masses of material. It's exactly what the most valued graduates of law schools traditionally have done in the first several years of their career. They call it document review, and it's the horror of 1980s and 1990s young law graduates. It's going away, and AI is playing a big part of that. At the high end of the value chain, so you're going to see a winnowing of the net amount of work that lawyers need to do is going to shrink. The high end of the value chain, I don't think is getting replaced. I think it's augmentation, as Scott said. Here, the decision making, the counseling, the strategizing, the development of tactics, all the things that more experienced and the better lawyers are called upon to do. And of course, it's far more than just person-to-person interactions, but there's a whole complex array of high-order cognitive tasks that are going on, and also rhetorical and persuasion tasks that are going on. AI will help with that and enhance the value for a smaller number of people. So the short answer is fewer lawyers, which I was expecting almost applause once I said fewer lawyers, but more value for the ones at the higher end of the pyramid. Separately, legal institutions, I think you're going to see as various algorithmic mechanisms become more capable of handling more repetitive, mundane forms of dispute resolution, helping to augment human-based decision-making systems by providing more accurate assessments of the value of claims or damages, you're hopefully going to see an increase in the efficiency of existing dispute resolution systems, whether formal or informal, and then perhaps some displacement into some sort of automated, perhaps more neutral, perhaps more immune from cognitive bias, more immune from political or emotional influences, all the sorts of things that we think give AI an advantage over human decision makers in certain areas, and that'll impact legal institutions. The rest of it, everything else Scott mentioned, the realms of medical decision making, the realm of transportation, the realm of police use of force, the realm of, Scott talks about things that are dangerous. What about combat? One of the biggest hot-button areas, of course, in AI policy circles is the question of autonomous weaponry, some of which is already sort of out there. These are all areas in which the law is going to have a lot to say, but I think those things are best saved for the barriers and risk part of the discussion.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Bob. Bill.
So, full disclosure, I was put on this panel a couple days ago, so I haven't had a lot of time to think about these issues, but they're very interesting to me. So, I'm a social psychologist, but I can speak for psychologists more generally. What we do is, as a researcher, we look at behavior and come up with theories, and then generally speaking, a lot of us will take them into the laboratory and test them out. And we've been pretty successful in doing that, coming up with theories and finding ones that are good, ones that are bad, and then writing about them. And, the problem is that when we try to distill out these phenomena, we always have a problem of going back to the real world and generalizing, because we've just kind of looked at more or less intuitively and building on previous theory as well. Come up with these theories, we test them, but we don't know for sure how well they generalize. And there's never been a good solution to that. And what I see, there's now a new wave within psychology of going out and say looking at millions of Facebook pieces of data from Facebook and going through those behaviors and generating through machine learning various inferences about the traits that people possess. And that actually has profound potential because it will finally give us some inkling of what's going on in the real world and potentially then translating that back into the laboratory where we can test those. So I think it has enormous potential for finally bridging the gap between reality and the experimentation that we do to test our notions of that reality. So that was my brief take on one of the positive things that came out.
Okay, great. So, yeah, so we've seen sort of different perspectives on benefits. We'll go now down the line. I'll remind you of what's remind everybody about what some of the benefits that you mentioned were.
Actually, can I add one thing?
Yeah, please.
So I forgot that we don't have an economist on the panel, so I kind of left out some of the economic stuff. So, the most obvious things that you probably hear the most about actually are, artificially intelligent agents, robots, doing things like self-driving cars, doing small manufacturing and revolutionizing how we manufacture. And again, this is something where we might see, full automation eventually and get enormous economic benefits from increased efficiency. But in the meantime, I think, again, we're going to see a lot of augmentation in these areas, where we're going to see driver assist before we see fully self-driving cars, where we see robots on the manufacturing floor and small manufacturing manufactories helping people on the floor manufacture things faster rather than just taking over their jobs and doing the parts that are harder for humans while allowing humans to do the parts that they are really good at.
Yeah, so maybe this is sort of resonates with what Bobby said too about sort of automating some of the drug work at the lower end of the value chain, perhaps. So let's move to what some of the barriers are, and let's try to save the risks. It's hard, we've been hinting at some of the risks as well, biases and job replacement and stuff like that. We'll save time for that. But first, let's focus on the potential positives, but especially to the extent that they haven't yet been realized. what do you see as the technical, legal, social, maybe economic barriers to getting from here to there? And so Scott, you talked about having artificial intelligence agents or technologies that can do some superhuman tasks such as bus scheduling and medical diagnoses as sort of a form of augmentation. Even if it's possible, that's not really happening in a widespread way necessarily everywhere yet. So what are some of the barriers to that happening, or robots doing dangerous tasks like going into the nuclear disaster areas? It's happened in a small way, but this isn't widespread. Working with disabled people, again, researchers are doing it, but this isn't widespread, and also replacing some of the drudge work or augmenting some of the drudge work that you just mentioned. So what are the barriers between getting from here to them becoming widespread and really impacting our society in a positive way?
Right. So yeah. So there's a couple. Some are practical, and I think some are more sort of psychological. So I think one of the biggest practical factors, especially for talking about robotics doing dangerous things, is just economies of scale. So robots are really expensive. The PR2 robot I used to work with at Will's Garage that was helping Henry Evans, the quadriplegic man I was mentioning before, $450,000 robot. Not necessarily practical to have in everyone's home. And these costs will come down as robots become more prevalent, but there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem where we can't get them in people's homes until they become cheaper, and we can't get them cheaper until we get them in lots of people's homes. So there's got to be some breakthrough product like the Roomba or something that really helps us scale up to these more complex robots that are going into people's homes. In terms of artificial intelligence more generally, looking outside of robotics, and I used the bad word, but I think one of the biggest problems is that some of these systems that we've developed they work really well, 90–95% of the time. It's that last 5 or 10% though that is a huge amount of work. And to really deploy these systems, not just to gain people's trust, but for them to actually be useful and increase productivity rather than decrease it, or reduce harm instead of increasing it, these things really have to work well. And we're finding that that last little percent can be difficult. And there are a lot of ways we can deal with this. I mean, some things are beginning to cross the threshold where self-driving cars aren't perfect, but we have a ton of data, and we're getting close to a point where they can reduce harm. They're not going to be perfect, but they're going to be better than humans. So that's one possible outcome. Another possibility is my colleagues and I are working on this sort of idea of robot call centers, that you can go and deploy a robot when it works about 90% of the time and can do a lot of things in people's homes, and when it gets confused, it calls up a call center where people are trained and can help it out, and hopefully can learn from these experiences and rely less and less on the call center over time. So finding ways to deal with the fact that these things don't work perfectly yet, but we can still deploy them and still find use out of them by mitigating some of the weaknesses. And then I guess the third thing that this is connected to is just the idea of societal acceptance. So being able to actually develop trust. And part of the way you develop trust is by having these mechanisms to mitigate failures. But even so, there are some psychological barriers to overcome, that even if robots or artificially intelligent agents are much more reliable than humans, when they do make a mistake, it might be more disturbing to people than when humans make a mistake. Or they may make different kinds of mistakes. And so even just the lack of predictability in trying to get in the robot's or the artificially intelligent agent's head and understanding why it did what it did could help ease fears. And so that's actually a big thrust of research now, is trying to help explain what artificially intelligent agents are doing and why, instead of them just acting intelligently but not really being able to get a window into why they're doing what they're doing.
Okay, good. So as I turn to you, Bobby, so you mentioned some of the benefits within the legal profession, getting rid of the sort of drudge work, augmenting at the high end, giving us fewer lawyers. We also touched on sort of the possibility of more efficient and bias-free decisions. With respect to those, but also with respect to the sort of possible benefits that Scott mentioned, working with disabled people, autonomous cars, augmentation. Scott focused on the sort of the barriers being cost, reliability, and trust acceptance. What are some of the legal barriers?
Absolutely. So as I was thinking about this one, I was thinking about The Simpsons and the sage Homer Simpson, who on one of my favorite episodes, he says beer, the cause of and cure to most of life's problems. That's kind of the role of the lawyer here too. Lawyers are in legal institutions are a big barrier in some respects, but also possibly the solution to a lot of the benefits we've identified as being desirable with artificial intelligent agents. The ultimate issue here is about where liability is allocated in our system. Insofar as what we're talking about is either fully autonomous decision making or anyways just augmented human decision making, you've introduced this external factor beyond the current status quo set of decision makers that are out there. And very often this is going to be somebody who's either been or something that's been manufactured, coded, created, sold, and produced by a third party and entering into the picture. And the question becomes, when some harm follows, whether because we live in an imperfect world and sometimes things go wrong, or at the other end of the spectrum because there's really something wrong with that artificially intelligent agent. Anywhere on the spectrum of possibilities, you've got to the system has to allocate liability. And you know, to make another comment about our society and what it is to be in America, we're going to sue. And when something goes wrong, someone's going to be taken to court, or at least the shadow of litigation. I have to tell my students all the time, you know, the impact of law isn't just what goes into court. It's that we all operate under the possibility of legal action. So the rules cast a shadow. This is very true in terms of companies deciding what products to try to take to market. It's not just the chicken and the egg problem. It's the fear that if you put the chicken out there, you'll get sued for it. And this is something that we're seeing already, of course, with assisted driving. Tesla's learning all about this. Everybody, all these manufacturers, it's not just Tesla. I have a new Chevy vehicle, and I was astonished to discover on a road trip that within a week of buying it, turns out I have lane assist, and it was pretty aggressive. I was not drifting, I was just kind of bored, so I was swerving, and the car disagreed with me about that. I thought, oh wow, I'm augmented. This is so cool. I started trying to tell my kids about it, and they told me to turn the music back on. But you just immediately see all the possibilities for litigation there, and of course this raises questions about whether we're going to take a top-down approach to deciding how to allocate the liabilities in a hopefully thoughtful way that will be designed to create the biggest net benefit, to smooth out the opportunities for innovation. Or we're going to have a bottom-up, litigation-driven approach in which the decentralized, almost common law, tort-based rulemaking process, which interacts with the insurance industry, creates all sorts of complex incentives that maybe will choke off innovation or slow it down, right? Maybe will also help create a more flexible approach. I mean, there's pros and cons to the top-down and the bottom-up model. I actually think what we're going to see, of course, is a bewildering variety of different answers for different industries worked out over a long and complex period of time, probably with elements of both, right? You're going to have a lot of regulation, federal, state, maybe local, just in the driver space. We're already seeing lots of that. But then you're also going to have lots of lawsuits and then lots of lobbying efforts to try to create statutory rules that will mediate what's going on with the liability. And so for my students, I can say, good news, even as the base of the pyramid is being erased, there's this whole new category of liabilities and concerns that will require lawyers until all the lawyers are displaced by artificial intelligent agents. The pyramid itself maybe is growing even as the base of it's being lopped off. And this has happened before. I'll just close by saying, this is what happened when steam power revolutionized transportation with railroads. It's exactly like this, though at a less pervasive scale. It happened again with motorized transportation and the shift from animal-driven transport to car-based transport. This will be a more pervasive version of the same phenomenon. So we kind of know how the story unfolds, I think.
Okay, good, thanks. Thanks, Bobby. And now, so Bill, let's assume that these benefits that Scott has been talking about, you know, working with disabled people and doing dangerous tasks and augmentation become technically possible, and that the liability issues become solved. What do you see from a social perspective as some of the barriers to people accepting artificial intelligence technologies in their job, in their sort of workplace, or in their private lives? And you know, you can either talk about the kinds of benefits we've talked about now, or you can jump ahead to more sort of the possibility of more capable personal assistants, sort of, that can maybe serve part of the social roles in our society. Do you see what do you see as the barriers to that becoming a part of our?
So one barrier is just the problem of control. So most of us have spent a lifetime driving our car, and we're not all that comfortable with giving over that control to a robot. And I think that even you were talking about partial assist, where you have the car that's sort of in control, but you can step in. And the problems with that, of course, are that you're not fully paying attention, and by stepping in, you may misread the situation that the computer has understood better than you can. So I've heard people are ambivalent about doing that sort of intermediary step for that reason. So there's the control issue. And then the other issue that people have, one psychological issue, is that as robots become more and more like people, as long as they seem like a robot, it's fine. But if they start to seem exactly like a person, but don't quite make it, that's really icky to people. They just don't. They don't want to, feel like this is fraudulent.
And there's a term in the field of social robotics called the uncanny valley. That people think they're cooler and cooler, and then really uncanny.
Right.
It freaks them out.
And this isn't exactly a documentary, but in Westworld, one of the first questions that people ask is, are you real? When they're encountering an android. And there's just something about knowing that this is a real person that makes people a lot more comfortable than dealing with a robot. So,
Okay. Good. And so one last pass. Well, maybe there'll be two. But the next thing I want to do. We've talked about possible benefits, possible barriers. But let's not pretend that it's all everything is positive. There are risks with artificial intelligence and technologies. And I almost did it too. And you've hinted at some of them a little bit, right? So Bobby talked about possibly more efficient and bias-free decisions, but you can obviously imagine that there'd be more bias, right? And the drudge work that replacing some of the drudge work, well, you can imagine that would have a negative impact on the economy, or what will people do? Autonomous cars, they could may be better than people, but they could also cause a new cause of accidents. So these are some of the things we've hinted at. But I guess what do you see as from the technical, legal, and social perspective as some of the biggest risks or potential negative impacts of AI technologies? And also, while you're at it, if you care to, what are some of the steps we could take now to mitigate these risks? And we've got about 5 minutes total, so let's be brief on this. It might be a lot.
So you sort of hinted at the idea of algorithms being discriminatory. So this has been an issue that a lot of people have started to look at in the field. So people looked at in education, for example. So if you have autonomous tutoring algorithms, they might optimize for men more than women, for example, for various reasons. Or even face detection algorithms sort of famously did not work well for a long time for people with darker skin, just because for socioeconomic reasons and other reasons, there were fewer pictures of people with darker skin online for the data that they were collecting to train these algorithms. So there are all kinds of problems with bias, discrimination, things not working well for certain groups of people that we're really going to have to look at. And luckily, there are principled statistical methods that are coming out to deal with this, but they're not quite there yet. Another risk, I guess, would be people not understanding the limitations of when algorithms work and don't, and sort of overusing them. So if we have some new great AI algorithm that can design bridges for us, and we say, oh, well, we don't even need engineers to check over these. I mean, that might not be the best idea. So we really have to understand when things work, when they don't, and how to limit that. And I guess that's related to the final point I would want to make, is coming back to safety again. That yes, it might be acceptable in some instances just to say we're going to reduce harm, but that's not sort of acceptable universally, especially where harm didn't exist before. So if we are in people's homes helping the disabled or the elderly, it's not acceptable to injure people while we're doing that. And so we really need to come up with better mathematical techniques that are going to give us either provable or that's typically not possible. So very high, very strong probabilistic guarantees of certain types of statement.
So I was also going to make the coded bias point. This is a real difficult deal, and there's a sort of a theoretical challenge here. For some decisions, is it possible that there really isn't a neutral approach? Is it possible that you have no choice in your design ultimately to confront certain dispositions one way or another? I think that's something that academics have an important role to play in trying to theorize that out. So in a lot of my work, I do a lot of national security stuff, and so I tend to, when I think about these issues, the one that's always most glaring and comes up a bunch is the sort of the Terminator fears, the Skynet fears, in the realm of subjecting or augmenting human decision making, or even more challengingly, removing the human from the loop, as they say, on lethal force decisions. On one hand, the general argument in favor of automating or bringing artificial intelligence aspects into use of lethal force is precisely in order to avoid the impacts of cognitive bias, emotional distortion, speed, all those sorts of things that can actually lead to terrible decisions. And it happens with police, it happens with militaries, it happens in all armed force or lethal force settings. On the other hand, this goes to the ick factor. We've been conditioned culturally, perhaps for very good reason, but certainly we have been conditioned culturally to be terrified of the idea of the machines being armed and making their own decisions about when to shoot. I don't know if there's anything that gets people more wound up about AI as a general topic. And it's interesting because it raises the possibility that we will purposefully choose not to empower algorithmic decision making in that setting, despite the fact that it may actually cause, like with driving, it may actually pretty clearly and predictably lead to a net decrease in actual harms. But the ick factor is real, not to be ignored. So I think that's an important part of this. I would finally say that in thinking about the risk and harms, the places where we want to be most careful as a general matter, if we want to think about this more systematically, we should be looking at areas where the artificially intelligent decision making will have an impact that is potentially systematic rather than individualized, especially where it can have a physical impact as opposed to something more ethereal. And then lastly, where the speed is such that the harm will be more or less fully realized right away. Those sorts of systems, whatever fits that definition, those are the places you probably want to proceed most cautiously. And I think in terms of setting the throttle towards race forward or go carefully, that's where you want to be pulled back the most. And in other areas, I think we should be more aggressive and innovative.
Okay. And yeah, from a social perspective, what
Yeah,
are the biggest risks?
so to just go back to my earlier example of how it could be using machine learning techniques and other techniques to analyze behavior could be game changer for the field of psychology. The risk, or at least the challenge, is making sense of what it is that these machines are providing us with. So one of the things psychologists have agreed there's 5 basic traits that humans possess, and it's been a fairly useful way of thinking about personality. But when the machines figure out personality of people based on their Facebook responses and others, they come up with these just bizarre categorizations that are based on some blend of some of the existing traits with some other stipulations like the context in which it occurs, etc. So at this point, we haven't yet figured out how to make sense of what it is these machines are telling us. And so I don't know if that's a risk, but a challenge will be to try to bridge that gulf between the language that the language that the machines are using to understand human behavior and the language that we traditionally use to understand human behavior.
Okay, good. Well, then, just as a closing opportunity for a closing statement, as we draw to the end of the time we have, we've talked about lots of different possible benefits and sort of the excitement that AI technologies bring, but also some of the barriers and then some of the big risks, like military especially. We haven't, we didn't dive into that deeply, but that's definitely there on the surface, and job loss and things like this that people do see as risks. So just as a closing statement, I'll ask, on balance, do you think progress in artificial intelligence is making the world a better or a worse place? Or another way of phrasing that, 50 years from now, do you think that people working in the field of artificial intelligence, like myself and Scott and our colleagues, are going to be thanked for helping, getting us to where we are now, or blamed for the for the the dire situation we're in. Let's go the opposite direction for this one.
I was reminded when you asked me this, told me this question last night. I was reminded as an exchange student in college, and I met my Danish parents where I was going to live for a year, and my Danish mom and Danish said to my Danish father that, oh, he seems like a nice young man, and he turned to her and said, we haven't seen the end of it. Which I guess is how I feel about AI processes right now. It looks really promising, and the fact that we can get so much of the grunt work, and apparently some of the lawyers, is a real positive. But I do worry that, with these robots, for example, that it seems to me there's a tension that to the extent that we give them agency, we lose control over them. And that, going back to Westworld, that seems to be a potential problem. And I'm not sure that we, as a society, have figured out how to deal with that. But that is what I see as the tension.
So are you hedging? You're not going to say positive or outweighs the negative, or the other way around?
It's been good so far.
Okay. All right, Bobby.
So if one way to kind of encapsulate this is from the sci-fi perspective, is this going to lead us more towards the Star Trek benign world in which work is, you don't even need it, the efficiency gains are so great that everybody just benefits, or is it more Terminator? I think 50 years from now we're more Star Trek than Terminator. I will say it's interesting, I love Westworld as well. It's like all good sci-fi, it's a lens for crystallizing our thoughts. And it raises the possibility, we usually think about independent agents as this threat. What if sometimes we're the threat and they're the heroes? There's going to be interesting questions, moral, theological, and certainly legal, about what are the rights of independent agents. If sometimes they're as smart as we are, and if they're independent decision makers, when do they have rights that could be wrong? And who's going to be, which one's the first one to sue, and which one of us is the first one to get sued by something artificial? It's not like corporations don't have legal standing, so why shouldn't an artificially intelligent agent be able to have legal standing at a certain point?
So should I?
That's a dystopian vision.
But you said you're thinking we're more Star Trek than
Yeah.
Terminator. So are you coming out?
Right, because I'm a lawyer, and that AI is going to need a lawyer.
Okay.
A whole new client base is being
So that's a positive, better for the world. This was a hedge. So what do you guys say?
Okay, I guess I'll balance it. This is completely unbalanced actually. But I feel that it's hardly even worth asking. Like there's going to be so much benefit that I think it's honestly, I guess as an insider, it's hard for me to see how the risks could possibly outweigh the benefits. Largely because, so I'll address the Terminator thing first, I guess. So, an artificially intelligent bus scheduler or Watson, making medical diagnoses, these things do not have intrinsic desires. They don't have agency. We're not talking about generalized intelligence. We're talking about an artificially intelligent technology, a specific system that does one thing. So at least for now, while we are developing those kinds of systems, there's virtually zero risk of a robot uprising because our autonomous bus scheduler is not going to rise up against its masters. To be perfectly honest, AI still has a long way to go. Now, I will say down the road, maybe someday this will be a concern when we start thinking about more generalized intelligence. I think though that it might even be premature, but people really already are thinking about this. So there's a paper that just came out of Berkeley recently called, I think it was called the off button. And it was, could a robot, can essentially we come up with mathematical formalisms that prevent a robot from disabling its own off switch, essentially. So people are thinking about these issues well ahead of time, and it is certainly not a cause.
So this is unabashed positive that AI is helping the world. So I hope people here have learned something or sort of started thinking about things in a different way. I, for one, definitely did learn something new. We think often in artificial intelligence is how can we measure the progress of artificial intelligence? What's the index? And we now have a new idea that we've never had before, that the AI index should be number of lawyers in the world. Thanks all for the.